Welcome to this lecture series on ethics. This lecture is going to discuss hedonism. Hedonism primarily as an ethical theory, but also we have to discuss the hedonistic approach as adopted by psychologists, because there is a strong psychological theory which says that human nature or human beings by nature seek pleasure. And in one sense we can also say that the ethical theory is to a very great extent based upon this psychological theory. So in that sense we have to see both approaches, but the primary emphasis will be on understanding hedonism as an ethical approach. And in the subsequent lectures we will also discuss the various kinds of hedonistic ethical frameworks, particularly utilitarianism. So we will begin with this. This is a quote from Jamri Bentham, an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. Jamri Bentham is a very famous philosopher, very notable and a very important figure, particularly in the history of utilitarianism, in the history of hedonistic thought. So what he says is that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It's for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as determine what we shall do. Bentham here claims that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So the first sentence in this advocates a psychological theory. It says that by nature man is like this. Then the latter half of this statement, Bentham goes on to say that it's for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do. So the ethical theory. So it's clear that Bentham is trying to derive his ethical theory from his psychological position. Now let's see hedonism a little closer. Here the word hedonism derived from the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. So the emphasis is on pleasure, and then as a psychological approach this is a theory about human nature, which I have already pointed out, which Jamri Bentham and many others are advocating this. So it says that human beings by nature seek pleasure. Pain and pleasure are the two important motivations, or rather the sole motivations which determine human actions. Whatever actions man performs, human beings would consider these two motivations. These two are the ultimate motivations. Again, as a moral theory which we are more interested in, actions derive their moral quality from their usefulness as a means to some end, and that some end is happiness or pleasure. So here again, the emphasis is on the consequences of the action, and the consequences are inevitably pleasure, and that alone is the most important motivation for performing any action, or ought to be the most important motivation to perform action. So here this figure will give you a very comprehensive picture of the entire project of hedonism, the different kinds of hedonism. So it says that hedonism can be broadly divided into two, which I have already mentioned: psychological hedonism, which says that only pleasure and pain motivate us, and the ethical hedonism, which says that only pleasure has value. Then ethical hedonism, we could see, further gets divided into egoistic hedonism or hedonistic egoism and hedonistic utilitarianism. Egoistic hedonism emphasizes on the individual. It says that every individual ought to seek, I underline the word ought, every individual ought to seek his or her pleasure. And utilitarianism is a theory which is other regarding, which says that it considers pleasure or happiness as the goal, no doubt. Like egoistic hedonism, it also considers pleasure or happiness as the goal, as the end, but it says that we have to consider the happiness or pleasure of the entire society or the entire humanity for that matter. It advocates a kind of maximalism and says that maximum happiness to the maximum number of people. In most simplistic terms, that is the most important slogan that captures the very essence of utilitarianism: maximum happiness to maximum number of people. And when we try to examine the historical roots of hedonism. Again, we have to see probably the Greek roots, the Greek philosophy, and this Greek philosopher Epicurus is probably the most important figure here. And on the other hand, we could also see that other civilizations also have hedonistic trends we could see there in their historical development. For example, in India, we could see the Charvakins. In one sense, we can say that they are hedonist par excellence, because they are also materialist. We will come to that later. This Epicurus, who lived between 341 to 270 BC, Epicurus advocates a unique philosophical approach towards life, and also advocates a form of hedonism, which in one sense is very unique, because it couples hedonism or pleasure with moderation. It says that real pleasure or real happiness can only be experienced only if you practice moderation. So he says that happiness or the avoidance of all kinds of pain is the highest good. Through the practice of moderation, we can attain this. So one has to pursue happiness, one has to seek happiness and try to avoid all kinds of pain. And the Charvakins in India, hedonism and materialism, as I already mentioned, they combine both. See, here before we proceed, we have to mention a little bit more about the Charvakins, because in the Indian context particularly, according to ancient India, there are 4 important goals of human life. They are called the dharma, artha, kama and moksha. These are the 4 important goals of life, purusharthas they are called. And out of these purusharthas, dharma, for example, is the path of righteous conduct, doing good, or rather morality, ethics, everything comes under this dharma. We can also understand India's history by following the different interpretations of dharma as conducted by different philosophical schools during different periods. See, for example, the Vedic India or the Vedas advocate a unique concept of dharma, which we can also see in the Upanishads. Upanishads carry a lot of discussions on dharma. There are references to Samanya dharma, Vishesha dharma, everything in the Upanishads as well. But when you come to later literature, particularly to the Buddhist era, Buddhism advocates a very different kind of concept of dharma, which doesn't understand dharma as it was understood by the Vedic religions. There are some differences, some important differences. It emphasizes ahimsa and various other aspects which was not really emphasized by the Vedic religion. But when you come to later literature, say for example Mahabharata or Ramayana or Bhagavad Gita, these texts we could see again a more elaborate kind of discussions on the concept of dharma. So following these discussions and debates on dharma, we can actually understand the history of ancient India. This is what I meant. But as I said, the 4 purusharthas, dharma, artha, kama. Artha is pleasure, anything that is sensually valuable, fame, everything comes under artha. Then kama is desire. It is desire for pleasure and aversion towards pain. So something which is very similar to the kind of happiness or pleasure these people, the hedonists, were advocating. And then the 4th one is moksha. Moksha is often treated as the highest purushartha, highest goal. It is also stated that moksha is the parama purushartha. But most of the Indian philosophical systems advocate all the 4, dharma, artha, kama and moksha, because they try to combine all the 4 and try to present life as a balance of all the 4. Everything is important. Artha is important, kama is important, dharma is important, and moksha is the ultimate objective. But when it comes to the Charvakins, we find a very different picture and a very interesting perspective. The Charvakins say that artha and kama are the only 2 purusharthas. They reject the validity of dharma and moksha. The important slogan for them is, eat, drink and be merry, man, you will die tomorrow. So they thus try to advocate a very popular kind of philosophy among the people. But to what extent they were successful is a different question, because we don't have any writings coming down to us from the Charvakins. Nothing is left to us. We don't know what happened to the literature. There are references to the Charvakin views here and there in Indian literature, and these have been collected by scholars. That is the only source of to know about the Charvakins and their views today. But in the Greek tradition, Epicurus and many others, they advocate a philosophy which is more comprehensive than the kind of materialism of the Charvakins. For example, as I already indicated, Epicurus was trying to argue that search for happiness, the pursuing happiness should be combined with moderation, the practice of moderation. So, one has to reduce one's wants, only then one can be really happy. And one should not be bothering about death and other things, because death is yet to happen. Death is not there. When I am here, death is not there. And when death happens, I am not there. Then why should I worry? This is a very famous Epicurean wisdom. Now, Epicurus advocated moderation, enjoy happiness by reducing wants. He who is not satisfied with a little is satisfied with nothing. So, this underlines the value of moderation, this statement. He who is not satisfied with a little is satisfied with nothing. Charvakins, on the other hand, as I indicated, they advocate materialism, and there is no dharma, no moksha, only artha and kama, eat, drink and be merry. After death, there is nothing. Now, we will try to understand hedonism in the modern context. So, as I mentioned, in the previous lecture also I indicated this when we were discussing egoism. We have seen that there is a descriptive model of egoism, descriptive approach towards egoism, as well as a normative approach. Similar to that, in hedonism also there are these two approaches. There is a descriptive approach which is largely psychological, as I already briefly discussed it, which is a psychological theory of the human nature, and then there is the normative theory, which is the ethical theory. So, now we will focus more on hedonism as a psychological theory, where it is a theory of human nature and also known as motivational hedonism. It is known as motivational hedonism because it says that pleasure and pain are the only motivation to act and not to act. So, if one is sure about pleasure going to be there as a consequence of one's action, then that is a great motivation, or rather that is a sole motivation for one to perform a particular action. Similarly, if one is quite sure about, or one is rather anticipating the possibility of pain as a consequence, then one would be a bit reluctant to act. So, pleasure and pain are the ultimate motivations to act and not to act. So, this is what hedonism as a psychological theory primarily argues. The desires to encounter pleasure and to avoid pain guide all of our behavior. So, the desire to encounter pleasure, to have pleasure, this pleasure seeking approach, which is so ingrained, which is so integral to human nature, is underlined here. Men see pleasant consequences and by nature do desire pleasure. By nature, we all as human beings desire pleasure. Then again, this need not be the great pleasure or the greatest pleasure, and not necessarily the most intense and the most lasting pleasure. So, this is the problem. Like, we are all by nature pleasure seeking, no doubt about it. No human being would consciously or even subconsciously seek pain. We would all try to avoid pain and seek pleasure. But then that need not necessarily be the most intensive kind of pleasure and the most lasting pleasure, and definitely need not be the greatest pleasure we seek always. So, this actually gives a room for an ethical theory. An ethical theory in this context can supplement the psychological theory and come up with the assumption that all human beings ought to seek the greatest pleasure, which is what utilitarians are doing. But then utilitarians do it in a different way, because they would argue that the actions would become morally good only if they produce maximum pleasure or the greatest pleasure to the greatest number of people, not just to the person who is performing the action, not just to the agent. So, it is not an exclusively agent centric form of morality they are trying to advocate. They are advocating hedonism, no doubt, but at the same time their hedonism is utilitarianism. A utility for the entire humanity is sought. Each person has an ultimate desire for her own happiness. This is from William Lilly's book, Textbook on Ethics. Then again, J.S. Mill says that happiness is one and only thing desirable in itself. So, what do you mean by desirable in itself? It means that that is the only thing which is intrinsically desirable. Everything is instrumentally desirable, everything else. But happiness is intrinsically desirable, it is desirable in itself. And again, happiness is desirable in itself. Everyone desires his own happiness. Each person desires his own happiness. Now, we have been talking about conceiving hedonism as a psychological theory. Now we have to consider hedonism as a theory about value, about human values. Now, pleasure is intrinsically valuable is taken for granted by hedonism as a theory about value as well, as an ethical theory also, or rather ethical hedonism, we can put it in that way. Now, what it does is that everything else like liberty, love, wealth, etc. have only instrumental value. So, all these things are valuable in life. We know that liberty is valuable. Love is, quite often we would say that love is intrinsically valuable, because we want love not because of something else, but because love is intrinsically valuable. Normally that is the way we understand it. Even liberty also. Why do you need freedom? Because freedom is intrinsically valuable. But the hedonist would argue that that is not so. These are all valuable things, no doubt in that, but they are only instrumentally valuable. Liberty is valuable because it is an instrument that takes us to the highest value, which is happiness. Wealth is valuable because it makes us happy. Love is valuable because it makes us happy. Everything else makes us happy, hence they are valuable. So, their value is not intrinsic but only instrumental, but the value of happiness is intrinsic in itself. Motivational hedonism supplements value hedonism and shapes the normative hedonistic approaches. So, this is what we are trying to argue. The normative hedonistic approaches, which are the ethical approaches surrounding the psychological theory of hedonism, or rather the perspective of hedonism, takes a lot from motivational hedonism, which is a psychological theory. It is supplemented by that theory. It presupposes that theory to a very great extent. Now, ethical hedonism. Pleasantness is the only quality because of which an experience is good or valuable. So, here the consequence aspect is underlined. Pleasantness is the consequence of an action here, and that makes the action valuable. No consequence of an action except pleasantness and unpleasantness are relevant in deciding whether it is good or not. So, to decide whether it is desirable, it is good, it is right, it is valuable, we have to see whether pleasantness is the consequence or not. Again, tells how men ought to act and what men ought to desire. In that sense, it proposes a very strong ethical theory. It tells what you should desire, what you ought to desire, and what you ought to do. And this is what William Lilly says. Now, as I mentioned earlier, ethical hedonism or the normative ethical hedonistic perspectives in general can be divided into egoistic hedonism and utilitarianism. Egoistic hedonism is, as the name indicates, suggests, we ought to do whatever makes us happiest. We, in the sense, each individual. So, the stress is on the individual here. The individual's happiness is important here, not happiness in general or not happiness of the general humanity, but the happiness of the individual who acts, who is the agent of action. So, according to this framework, an action becomes right if that action leads to consequences which do good to the individual, which makes the individual, the agent, happy, or rather the happiest. Which action makes him the happiest is the good action for him, is the ethically more valuable action for him. Do whatever gives us with the most net pleasure after pain is subtracted. So, there is a suggestion of a calculus. You have to see each action, each course of action, and see which course of action gives you the net pleasure after pain is subtracted. So, a kind of a cost benefit analysis you can perform before you consider when you consider your choices before you take your final decision on which course of action is good for you. There is no need to consider those consequences for anyone other than oneself. So this is a very interesting suggestion, and rather this suggestion has got some consequences which are also sometimes very unpleasant and undesirable, because it says that there is no need to consider, when you have to decide the moral value, moral worth of an action, one need not consider the consequences for anyone other than oneself. Which means that if I am badly in need of some money, I can steal it from anyone else. I don't have to basically bother about what consequences this will have on that other person from whom I am stealing this money. Whatever happens to him or her, I don't have to just care about it. I just have to get my things done, because my happiness is more important here. So this could be an implicit suggestion of this statement, that we don't have to bother about the consequence these actions will have on other people. And here, independent of the feelings of sympathy and guilt, this becomes an imperative for an ethical egoist, because in order to be a perfect egoistic hedonist, a person needs to be as insensitive as possible, as indifferent as possible to the problems of other people. One has to consider only one's own problem and try to find the happiest solution for one's problem, there even at the expense of other people's happiness. Other people might become unhappy, but that is not our concern. They are happy or unhappy, that's not our concern. What happens to them is not our concern. We have to really bother only about ourselves. Now, in contrast to this, utilitarianism, which actually stresses on the collective happiness of people, which stresses on the maximum happiness of maximum number of people, is a philosophical framework that is essentially other regarding. It is concerned about other people. It's concerned about the entire humanity in a very important manner. It says that the right action is the one that produces the greatest net happiness for all concerned. Greatest net happiness for all concerned. So this is for all. So it takes into account all the stakeholders, so that it's essentially other regarding. It's not so egoistic in that sense. So in one sense we can say that egoistic hedonism fails as an ethical theory, as we saw in the previous lecture that egoism fails as an ethical theory. Here egoistic hedonism also fails as an ethical theory, because it's not other regarding, because it doesn't make sense in a social context to be presented as a theory so that everyone can follow it. It will have very adverse consequences if everyone becomes egoistic hedonist. Similarly, again, it advocates maximalism, maximum happiness to maximum number, then again more stable moral theory than egoistic hedonism, as it is other regarding. So this makes it a more consistent moral theory or ethical perspective, but it has got its problems, because it still, regardless of the fact that it's other regarding, it emphasizes on consequences of action. It tells you that other things are unimportant, intention of the action, all these things are unimportant. What is important is only consequences. Consequences for others also matter. It's not just consequences for oneself alone, but what consequences one's action are going to have on other people's life is also a concern here. So in that sense it's more important. Before we conclude, we'll have a little closer look on utilitarianism, and we'll have an elaborate analysis of utilitarianism in the coming lecture. Utilitarianism emphasizes the usefulness of action. Like hedonism, the consequences are very important in utilitarianism. The usefulness of an action is important here, and again usefulness is equated with utility, which is further equated with happiness. That is the reason why it's called utilitarianism. It's actually maximum utility to maximum number of people, not happiness. But then later on what happens is that utility is equated with happiness or pleasure by utilitarians. That is why they became hedonists. And they present to us a very practical approach, because utilitarian framework or utilitarian approaches can be employed in order to solve many practical issues. Say for example, if you want to construct a dam in a particular site or a bridge, what you can do is that constructing a dam, for example, raises a lot of ethical problems, a lot of moral issues, because with regard to the environment and other things. But here you can probably go for a cost benefit analysis and see in what way the society is going to benefit if the dam is constructed. And you can also see what is the cost, like how much forest will get submerged, to what extent the environment is getting affected. All these things can be studied by expert scientific teams, and then finally take a decision. How many people are going to get employment? In what sense this is going to help the government to serve water and also improve the agricultural facilities in the society? All these things can be considered and finally take a decision. So in that sense, utilitarianism, with its emphasis on utility and also consequences, suggests or presents a very practical approach to morality. Greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the end and criterion. So we have a very objective criterion here, which can be quantified to a very great extent. To what extent people are going to be benefited and what are the expenses, what is the loss. All these things can be calculated more or less objectively and scientifically. So we can arrive at a sort of a perfect non-controversial kind of a final decision on such matters, which is not very easy, of course, but to a very great extent it is a very practical approach and applied to civics and politics. Particularly in these areas, it has tremendous practical applications because of its objective approach to morality and moral issues. Now, we wind up with this one point, that we are now going to start our discussions on utilitarianism proper, and we would be discussing two important frameworks. One is called the act utilitarianism, other one is rule utilitarianism, and we would be discussing, analyzing the contributions of two important thinkers here, Jamri Bentham and J.S. Mill. These are the two important philosophers whom we are going to discuss, their contributions. Now, before that, we will ask a very general question here and then start our discussions on utilitarianism. What is the purpose of morality? And we have been discussing about ethics, morality in this course for nearly about 15 lectures. We have been doing that, and we saw that the purpose of ethics or purpose of morality is to find ways to negotiate conflicts that might occur in society, particularly in our society, which is getting increasingly complex because the presence of various social institutions and the multiplicity, the diversity of requirements and desires and demands and all kinds of problems we face today. So morality has a definite purpose, no doubt about it. Morality helps a lot for negotiations, reducing the levels of conflicts in society and also establishing some norms which are acceptable for everyone. Now, utilitarianism envisages a greater role for morality. It is not just an armchair philosophy, it is a very practical kind of an approach to philosophy. How to make the world a better place? That is a practical question which utilitarianism raises. In what way we can make this world a better place for us to live? How to take decisions which would ultimately lead us to better decisions, implementing better plans, better policies and all that. Not by making people with good character or good intentions. This is very clear. Virtue ethics, for example, it is concerned about making people good, their character very good. So by making a lot of good people in the society, you may not ultimately make the society a better place to live, the world a better place to live. And again, a lot of people with very good intention may also not make the world a better place to live. For that, you need to take practical decisions and implement them practically, which would ultimately lead to very good consequences to maximum number of people. Decisions should affect the lives of people in a very positive manner. How can you do that? By devising actions that will produce good consequences. So this is the purpose of morality here. Morality is not just an armchair business, but it's a practical activity. It has a purpose. It has to guide people's actions properly in order to produce a better world. So in that sense, utilitarianism is trying to devise proper philosophy with its concept of utility, the principle of unity, which is self-evident principle of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is equated with pleasure, the most reasonable guide to both individual morality and public policy, pleasures and avoidance of pain, rational basis on which the laws of all nations should be built. Principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever. And finally, ethical theory should be the words ought and right and wrong, etc., gain meaning from the notion of utility. So this is the framework for a practical philosophy, for a practical ethics, for a practical moral thought. And this is what the utilitarians are trying to do. So we will wind up our discussion here on this problem, and we'll continue our discussions on utilitarianism in the following lecture as well. For the time being, we'll wind up. Thank you.